The greatest empire the world has ever known began not with the clash of mighty armies or the thunder of conquest, but with a single act of fratricide on a windswept hill beside the Tiber River. Picture yourself drifting back through the centuries, past the rise and fall of nations, past the birth of Christianity, past the golden age of Greece, to a time when Rome was nothing more than a collection of mud huts scattered across 7 hills. Here, in the mists of legend and the shadows of history, our story begins. Tonight, as you surrender to sleep, let me guide you through the complete saga of Rome, from the mythical twins nursed by a she-wolf to the final emperor fleeing Constantinople's burning walls. We'll witness the birth, triumph, and ultimate transformation of the most influential civilization in human history. This isn't just the story of conquest and glory, though there will be plenty of both. This is the tale of how a small Italian city-state grew to rule 3 continents, how its laws still govern us today, and how its fall marked the end of the ancient world and the beginning of our own. The Romans themselves loved to tell stories, especially about their origins. They understood that every great empire needs a great beginning, and so they crafted tales worthy of the civilization they would become. Whether these stories reflect historical truth or poetic imagination matters less than what they reveal about the Roman character. These are people who believed they were destined for greatness, chosen by the gods themselves to rule the world. Our journey begins in the realm of myth, where gods walk among mortals and destiny shapes the fate of nations. The story the Romans told about their origins reveals everything you need to know about their ambitions, their values, and their unshakable belief that they were meant to inherit the earth. Long before the eagles of Rome cast their shadows across the Mediterranean, before Caesar crossed the Rubicon or Augustus transformed a republic into an empire, there lived a king named Numitor in the ancient city of Alba Longa. This peaceful ruler had a brother named Amulius, whose heart burned with jealousy and ambition. In a tale as old as Cain and Abel, Amulius overthrew his brother, seizing the throne for himself. But Numitor had a daughter, Rhea Silvia, and Amulius knew that any sons she might bear could one day challenge his stolen crown. To prevent this threat, Amulius forced Rhea Silvia to become a Vestal virgin, binding her with sacred vows of chastity that would ensure she bore no children. For years, his plan seemed to work perfectly. Rhea Silvia tended the sacred flame in the temple, her life dedicated to the goddess Vesta, her bloodline destined to end with her. But the gods, it seems, had other plans. Mars, the god of war himself, looked down upon the beautiful priestess and was consumed with desire. Some say he appeared to her in a sacred grove, others that he came to her in dreams, but all agree that from their divine union came something extraordinary. Rhea Silvia found herself carrying the children of a god, twin boys who would grow to reshape the world. When Amulius discovered his niece's pregnancy, his rage knew no bounds. The sacred vows had been broken, his carefully laid plans shattered. In his fury, he ordered Rhea Silvia thrown into the Tiber River, though some versions of the tale suggest she was merely imprisoned. As for the twin babies, they posed an even greater threat. Sons of Mars himself, they carried divine blood and royal heritage. Amulius commanded his servants to take the infants and drown them in the river, ending the threat to his rule once and for all. But destiny is not so easily thwarted. The servants, perhaps moved by pity or fear of divine retribution, placed the babies in a basket and set them adrift on the Tiber's waters. The river, swollen with recent rains, carried the basket downstream until it came to rest on the muddy banks near the future site of Rome. There, beneath the shade of a sacred fig tree, the abandoned princes lay crying in their makeshift cradle. It was then that one of history's most famous rescues took place. A she-wolf, drawn by the sound of the infant's cries, emerged from the wilderness. Rather than seeing prey, she saw children in need. The wild creature nursed the divine twins with her own milk, protecting them from the elements and the dangers of the untamed landscape. This image of the she-wolf suckling Romulus and Remus would become Rome's most enduring symbol, carved in stone and cast in bronze, reminding every Roman of their city's miraculous origins. The twins might have grown up wild in the forests had not Faustulus, a shepherd tending his flocks nearby, discovered them. This kind-hearted man and his wife, Acca Laurentia, took the boys into their humble home, raising them as their own sons. Under their care, Romulus and Remus grew into strong, bold young men, natural leaders who gathered other shepherds and outcasts around them. They lived by their wits and their courage, raiding the cattle of neighboring tribes and redistributing the wealth among their followers. As the brothers matured, their true nature began to manifest. They possessed a charisma that drew men to follow them, a strategic brilliance that won them victory after victory, and an ambition that could not be contained within the simple life of shepherds. They began to dream of founding a city of their own, a place where they could rule as kings rather than live as outcasts. But first, they learned the truth of their origins. Some say a captured enemy revealed their royal blood during interrogation. Others that their grandfather Numitor recognized them when they were brought before him as prisoners. However the revelation came, Romulus and Remus discovered they were the grandsons of the rightful king of Alba Longa, sons of Mars himself, destined for greatness beyond their humble upbringing. With this knowledge came responsibility. The brothers gathered their followers and marched on Alba Longa, where they overthrew the usurper Amulius and restored their grandfather Numitor to his rightful throne. Justice had been served, the family honor restored, but the twins were not content to settle into comfortable positions as princes in their grandfather's court. The divine blood that flowed in their veins called them to greater things. They decided to found a new city at the place where they had been saved, where the she-wolf had nursed them beneath the sacred fig tree. It seemed fitting that their city should rise where their lives had been preserved by divine intervention. But even brothers born of the same womb and raised by the same parents cannot always agree on matters of such importance. The question arose, who would rule this new city? Both brothers had equal claim by birth, equal support among their followers, equal divine heritage. To settle the matter, they turned to the gods for guidance, each taking position on a different hill to watch for omens in the flight of birds. Remus, standing on the Aventine hill, saw 6 vultures soaring overhead. Romulus, positioned on the Palatine hill, claimed to have seen 12. The dispute that followed would echo through Roman history, establishing patterns of ambition and violence that would define the empire for centuries to come. Each brother claimed the gods had chosen him. Each insisted the omen proved his right to rule. Their followers began to take sides, tension escalated, and what should have been a moment of triumph became a source of bitter conflict. In some versions of the story, the argument came to blows immediately. In others, the brothers attempted to rule jointly, marking out the boundaries of their new city together. But whether the violence erupted instantly or built over time, the result was the same. In a moment of rage or calculation, Romulus killed his twin brother Remus, becoming the sole founder of what would become the greatest city in the ancient world. The exact manner of Remus's death varies in the telling. Some say Romulus struck him down with his own hand during their quarrel. Others claim that Remus, in a gesture of contempt, leaped over the boundary walls his brother was constructing, and Romulus killed him for this violation of the sacred city limits. The most dramatic version has Romulus declaring as he stood over his brother's body, "So perish anyone who dares to cross my walls." Regardless of the precise details, the message was clear. Rome would be a city of law and order, where boundaries were sacred and authority absolute. Even brotherhood would not protect those who challenged the established order. This act of fratricide, terrible as it was, established the principle that would guide Roman expansion for centuries. Rome's interests came before all else, even the most sacred bonds of family. Standing alone on the Palatine Hill, his brother's blood still warm on his hands, Romulus became the first king of Rome. The year, according to Roman reckoning, was 753 BCE, a date that would serve as the starting point for all future Roman chronology. From this moment forward, years would be measured as from the founding of the city, ab urbe condita. But a king without subjects is no king at all, and Romulus faced the immediate challenge of populating his new city. The settlement on the Palatine Hill was little more than a collection of huts surrounded by a wooden palisade, hardly impressive enough to attract settlers from the established cities of central Italy. Romulus needed to be creative if his city was to survive its first generation. His solution was radical for its time. Rome would become a sanctuary for outcasts. Slaves who escaped their masters, debtors fleeing their creditors, criminals seeking a fresh start, younger sons with no inheritance, adventurers looking for opportunity, all were welcome within Rome's boundaries. This policy of inclusion, born of necessity, would become one of Rome's greatest strengths. While other cities restricted citizenship to those of proper birth, Rome welcomed anyone willing to contribute to its growth. The policy worked brilliantly. Within a short time, Rome's population swelled with ambitious men from across central Italy. They brought skills, knowledge, and most importantly, the desperate energy of people with nothing to lose and everything to gain. These weren't comfortable citizens protecting inherited wealth, but hungry men eager to build something new. However, this immigration policy created an unexpected problem. The newcomers were overwhelmingly male, and while Rome had gained a population, it had not gained the means to perpetuate itself. Without women to bear children, the city would die with its first generation. Romulus approached the neighboring tribes, seeking marriage alliances that would provide wives for his followers, but the established peoples of Latium wanted nothing to do with this upstart city of outcasts and refugees. Faced with rejection through diplomacy, Romulus turned to deception and force. He announced a great festival in honor of Neptune, inviting all the neighboring peoples to attend. The Sabines, a powerful tribe living in the hills north of Rome, came in great numbers, bringing their wives and daughters to enjoy the festivities. As the celebration reached its height, with wine flowing freely and the visitors relaxed and unsuspecting, Romulus gave a prearranged signal. Roman men throughout the crowd suddenly seized the Sabine women, carrying them off while their menfolk stood stunned by the audacity of the act. This event, known to history as the rape of the Sabine women, was not rape in the modern sense, but rather abduction for the purpose of marriage. The Romans treated their captives with honor, promising them the rights and status of wives rather than slaves. The Sabine men, naturally, were outraged by this violation of hospitality and theft of their women. They returned to their homes to gather armies and allies, preparing for war against the audacious Romans. For months, they planned their revenge, while Romulus strengthened his defenses and worked to win the loyalty of his new subjects. When the Sabines finally marched on Rome, they found the city's gates mysteriously open. Tarpeia, daughter of the Roman commander of the citadel, had been bribed with promises of Sabine gold to betray her people. But the Sabines, having used her treachery, felt only disgust for a traitor. Instead of rewarding her with gold, they crushed her beneath their shields, and the rock from which she fell became known as the Tarpeian Rock, a place of execution for traitors in later Roman history. The battle that followed seemed destined to destroy the young city. Sabine warriors poured through the streets, while Romans fought desperately to defend their homes. The conflict raged with neither side able to gain decisive advantage, until something unexpected happened that would set the pattern for Rome's future expansion. The Sabine women, who had been the cause of the conflict, threw themselves between the opposing armies. They had been Romans long enough to bear children to their new husbands, creating bonds that transcended their origins. "Stop this madness," they cried. "You fight against your sons-in-law and your fathers-in-law. If you cannot bear the ties that bind us, then turn your anger on us instead. We are the cause of this war, the cause of wounds and death to both our husbands and our fathers." Their intervention had a profound effect on both armies. Gradually, weapons were lowered, and the two peoples began to talk rather than fight. What emerged from these negotiations was revolutionary. Rather than one people conquering the other, Romans and Sabines would merge into a single nation. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, would rule jointly with Romulus. Their peoples would intermarry freely, and their customs would blend into something new. This peaceful resolution established a pattern that would serve Rome well throughout its expansion. Unlike other conquerors who ruled over subject peoples, Rome consistently offered a path to full membership in the Roman community. Former enemies could become Roman citizens. Their gods could join the Roman pantheon. Their customs could enrich Roman culture. This genius for assimilation rather than mere domination would prove to be one of the secrets of Roman success. The joint reign of Romulus and Titus Tatius lasted only a few years before the Sabine king died, leaving Romulus as sole ruler. But the precedent had been set. Rome was not just a city, but an idea. A community that could grow by including rather than excluding, by transforming enemies into allies. This would become the Roman way, repeated countless times as the city expanded across Italy and beyond. Under Romulus's continued rule, Rome began to take on the characteristics that would define it for centuries to come. The king established the Senate, a council of elders drawn from the leading families, to advise him on matters of state. He organized the people into 3 tribes and 30 curiae for military and voting purposes. He created the first Roman calendar and established many of the religious rituals that would remain central to Roman life. Most importantly, Romulus began the process of territorial expansion that would eventually encompass the Mediterranean world. Rome fought and defeated neighboring cities, but rather than simply plundering them, the Romans offered the defeated peoples a choice. They could be destroyed, or they could join the growing Roman Confederation. Most chose to join, adding their strength to Rome's while maintaining their local identities under Roman protection. After ruling for 37 years, Romulus met an end as mysterious as his beginning. According to legend, he was reviewing troops on the Campus Martius when a sudden thunderstorm arose. Dark clouds enveloped the king, and when they cleared, he had vanished. Some claimed he had been taken up to join the gods. Others whispered that the senators had murdered him during the confusion and disposed of his body. Whether Romulus ascended to Olympus or met a more earthly fate, his legacy was secure. He had transformed a collection of mud huts into the foundation of an empire, established the principles that would guide Roman expansion, and created institutions that would endure for over 1,000 years. The city he founded through fratricide and populated with outcasts was poised to become the master of the known world. But this was only the beginning. 6 more kings would rule Rome after Romulus, each adding his own contributions to the growing city's character and capabilities. The monarchy would give way to a republic, the republic to an empire, and through it all, the patterns established in those earliest days would continue to shape Roman destiny. As you drift deeper into sleep, picture that first settlement on the Palatine Hill, its wooden walls enclosing a few hundred determined men and their Sabine wives. From such humble beginnings, guided by the ambition of its legendary founder and the practical wisdom of its early institutions, Rome would grow to rule an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. The she-wolf's children had found their destiny, and the world would never be the same. The legend of Romulus had planted the seed, but for Rome to truly flourish, it needed more than mythical origins. It needed the steady hand of builders, the wisdom of lawmakers, and the vision of rulers who could transform a collection of hilltop settlements into something approaching civilization. The 7 kings who followed would each leave their mark on the growing city, establishing traditions that would echo through the corridors of time long after their names were carved in stone. After Romulus vanished in that mysterious thunderstorm, the Romans faced their first constitutional crisis. How does a people choose a new king when their founder has been claimed by the gods? The solution they devised would become a model for future transitions of power. Rather than allowing ambitious nobles to fight for the throne, they established the principle of election. The Senate would nominate candidates, and the people would choose from among them. This wasn't democracy as we understand it, but it was a crucial step away from pure hereditary monarchy. The man they chose could not have been more different from the warrior founder who preceded him. Numa Pompilius was a Sabine, selected perhaps to honour the peaceful merger that had doubled Rome's population. Where Romulus had been a man of war, Numa was a man of peace. Where the first king had expanded through conquest, the second would build through law and religion. Legend painted Numa as a philosopher king, a man so wise that the goddess Diana herself served as his counselor, meeting him in sacred groves to share divine wisdom. Whether or not he actually communed with deities, Numa possessed the practical intelligence to understand that a city built on violence needed the stabilizing influence of law and custom. His reign of 43 years transformed Rome from a rough frontier settlement into something approaching a proper city. Numa's greatest contribution was religious. He established the calendar that would govern Roman life, dividing the year into 12 months and designating which days were appropriate for public business and which were reserved for the gods. He created the priesthoods that would oversee Rome's relationship with the divine, including the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest whose authority would one day be claimed by emperors and eventually by the Pope himself. Under Numa's guidance, temples rose throughout the city. The most important was dedicated to Janus, the two-faced god who looked both forward and backward, whose temple doors would be closed only when Rome was at peace. In Numa's time, those doors remained shut, but they would rarely be closed again in Rome's long history. Peace, it seemed, was not Rome's natural state. The king also established the Vestal Virgins, priestesses charged with maintaining the sacred flame that symbolized Rome's eternal life. These women, drawn from noble families and bound by vows of chastity, wielded enormous influence in Roman society. Their word could save a condemned criminal, their blessing could ensure a military victory, and their violation of their sacred vows could bring disaster upon the entire city. The Vestals embodied Rome's understanding that divine favor was essential to worldly success. Perhaps most importantly, Numa codified the laws that would govern Roman society. Where Romulus had ruled through personal authority and the loyalty of his followers, Numa created written statutes that applied equally to all citizens. These laws covered everything from property rights to religious obligations, from marriage customs to the proper conduct of business. They established the principle that would become central to Roman civilization. That law, not the whim of rulers, should govern human affairs. When Numa died peacefully in his bed, full of years and honor, he left behind a transformed city. Rome now possessed the institutions of civilization, established priesthoods, regular festivals, written laws, and customs that bound the community together. The wild energy of Romulus's followers had been channeled into productive channels, creating the foundation upon which a great city could rise. The third king chosen by the Romans marked a return to the martial spirit of their founder. Tullus Hostilius, whose very name suggested hostility, believed that Rome's destiny lay not in peaceful contemplation, but in glorious conquest. The temple of Janus, closed throughout Numa's reign, was thrown open as Rome prepared for war. Tullus looked south toward Alba Longa, the ancient city from which Romulus and Remus had sprung. Despite their shared ancestry, tensions had grown between Rome and the mother city. Trade disputes escalated into cattle raids into border skirmishes, and border skirmishes into declarations of war. But rather than engage in a costly siege that might devastate both cities, the kings agreed to settle their differences through single combat. Each side would choose 3 champions to fight on behalf of their people. Rome selected the Horatii triplets, 3 brothers renowned for their skill at arms. Alba Longa chose the Curiatii, equally famous warriors who happened to be cousins to the Roman champions. The battle that followed became legend, sung by poets and retold by historians for generations. The combat began badly for Rome. 2 of the Horatii fell quickly, leaving the 3rd brother alone against 3 wounded but still dangerous opponents. Rather than stand and die heroically, the surviving Roman feigned retreat, drawing his enemies after him at different speeds according to their injuries. When they became separated, he turned and killed them one by one, winning victory for Rome through cunning rather than mere courage. This triumph established a pattern that would define Roman military thinking for centuries. Victory mattered more than honor, results more than reputation. A Roman general who won through trickery was celebrated more than one who lost gloriously. This practical approach to warfare would serve Rome well in the countless battles to come. The victory over Alba Longa brought more than glory. Following their custom of inclusion rather than destruction, the Romans offered the defeated Albans full citizenship and a new home within Rome's growing boundaries. The population of the city doubled overnight, and with it came new skills, new traditions, and new blood to strengthen the Roman stock. But Tullus's appetite for war was far from satisfied. He led Roman armies against the Sabines, the Volscians, and other neighboring peoples, each victory adding to Rome's territory and reputation. Under his rule, Rome began to develop the military traditions that would make its legions feared across the known world. Regular training, strict discipline, standardized equipment, and innovative tactics transformed Roman farmers into professional soldiers. The king's obsession with warfare, however, may have been his undoing. After 32 years of constant campaigning, Tullus met a mysterious end. Some said he was struck by lightning while performing a sacrifice to Jupiter, a sign of divine displeasure at his neglect of religious duties. Others whispered that the gods were punishing him for his excessive love of war. Whatever the truth, his death served as a reminder that even kings must respect the balance between martial valor and pious observance. The Romans, chastened by their king's fate, chose as his successor a man who promised to restore that balance. Ancus Marcius, grandson of Numa Pompilius, combined his grandfather's respect for religion with a more practical understanding of Rome's needs. He would be a king of both war and peace, expansion and consolidation. Ancus inherited a city that had grown far beyond its original boundaries on the Palatine Hill. Roman territory now stretched across multiple hills and down to the banks of the Tiber. The king recognized that this growth brought new challenges and opportunities. Rome needed better defenses, improved infrastructure, and most importantly, access to the sea. His first great project was the construction of Rome's first bridge across the Tiber. This wasn't merely an engineering achievement, but a strategic masterstroke. Control of the river crossing meant control of trade between the inland cities of Latium and the Mediterranean world. Merchants who had previously bypassed Rome now had to pass through it, bringing wealth and information into the growing city. But Ancus understood that a bridge was only as valuable as the territory it connected. To secure Rome's access to the sea, he founded the port city of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. This new settlement, protected by Roman walls and governed by Roman law, became the funnel through which the wealth of the Mediterranean would flow into Rome. Salt works were established to preserve food for the growing population, and warehouses rose to store goods from distant lands. The king also expanded Rome's physical boundaries, incorporating the Janiculum Hill across the river into the city's defences. New walls were built to protect the enlarged settlement, and aqueducts were constructed to bring fresh water from distant springs. Under Ancus's guidance, Rome began to look less like an overgrown village and more like a proper city. His military campaigns were more limited than Tullus's had been, but they were carefully chosen for maximum strategic benefit. Rather than seeking glory through conquest, Ancus fought to secure Rome's borders and trade routes. He defeated the Latins, who threatened Roman commerce, but rather than destroying their cities, he transplanted entire populations to Rome, adding their skills to the growing metropolis. Perhaps most importantly, Ancus established many of the customs that would govern Roman religious and civil life. He created the fetial priests, whose rituals governed the declaration of war and the making of peace. He established procedures for the incorporation of new citizens, ensuring that Rome could continue to grow through inclusion rather than mere conquest. He even regularized the gladiatorial games, transforming what had been simple funeral rites into elaborate spectacles that would one day captivate the entire Roman world. When Ancus died after 24 years of rule, he left behind a city transformed. Rome now controlled the mouth of the Tiber, commanded the trade routes of central Italy, and possessed the infrastructure to support a much larger population. The foundation had been laid for the commercial empire that would eventually span 3 continents. The throne now passed to a man who would bring foreign influence directly into the heart of Roman power. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was not Roman by birth, but Etruscan, member of a sophisticated civilization that had long dominated central Italy. His very presence on the Roman throne marked a new phase in the city's development, as it began to absorb the advanced arts and sciences of its more cultured neighbours. Tarquin, as history knows him, had come to Rome as a wealthy immigrant, drawn by the city's reputation for welcoming talented foreigners. His Etruscan heritage brought with it knowledge of engineering, architecture, and urban planning far in advance of anything Romans had previously known. Under his guidance, the rough frontier settlement would begin its transformation into a city worthy of comparison with the great centres of the ancient world. The new king's first priority was infrastructure on a scale never before attempted in Rome. He began construction of the great sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, that would drain the marshy valley between the hills and make possible the creation of the Forum, Rome's central gathering place. This engineering marvel, parts of which still function today, demonstrated Roman ambition to reshape the very landscape to serve their needs. Tarquin also began construction of the Great Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, a project so massive that it would not be completed until after his death. This temple, with its Etruscan-influenced architecture and enormous scale, was intended to rival the greatest shrines of the ancient world. It would become the spiritual center of Roman power, where generals would come to give thanks for victory and where the most sacred ceremonies of state would be performed. The king understood that spectacle was as important as substance in governing a growing city. He established the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing stadium that would one day hold 250,000 spectators. He organized the first formal gladiatorial games, transforming what had been simple funeral rites into elaborate public entertainments. These spectacles served multiple purposes. They honored the gods, demonstrated Roman wealth and power, and provided outlets for the aggressive energies of the urban population. Under Tarquin's rule, Rome began to develop the characteristics that would define it for centuries to come. The city became a magnet for immigrants from across Italy, drawn by opportunities for advancement unavailable in their homelands. Etruscan artisans brought their skills in metalworking and sculpture. Greek merchants introduced new trading networks, and ambitious individuals from dozens of tribes sought their fortunes in the growing metropolis. This cosmopolitan atmosphere fostered innovation and cultural development. Roman art began to show Etruscan influences. Roman religion incorporated deities from across the Mediterranean, and Roman society developed the complex class structures that would characterize it throughout its history. The city was becoming not just larger, but more sophisticated, more connected to the wider world, more capable of projecting power beyond its immediate borders. After 38 years of transformative rule, Tarquin was assassinated by the sons of his predecessor, who resented foreign influence in Roman affairs. But his legacy was secure. He had given Rome the infrastructure and institutions necessary for greatness, had opened the city to the wider Mediterranean world, and had established the precedent that merit, not birth, should determine a man's place in Roman society. The sixth king would prove to be one of the most important in Roman history, though his innovations were constitutional rather than architectural. Servius Tullius, who may have been born a slave, rose to power through ability and marriage into the royal family. His reign would see the creation of Rome's first written constitution and the establishment of principles that would govern Roman society for centuries. Servius understood that Rome's rapid growth had created new challenges. The old tribal divisions established by Romulus no longer reflected the city's complex social and economic realities. Citizens ranged from wealthy landowners to poor immigrants, from established families to recent arrivals, from skilled artisans to common laborers. The king needed a new system that could organize this diverse population for both military service and political participation. His solution was revolutionary, the centuriate system, which divided all Roman citizens into classes based on wealth rather than birth. The richest citizens who could afford the best armor and weapons were enrolled in the first class and given the greatest political influence. Those with moderate means formed the lower classes, while the poorest served as light-armed troops. This system ensured that those with the greatest stake in Rome's success had the greatest say in its governance, while still providing roles for citizens of all backgrounds. The king also conducted Rome's first census, a comprehensive survey of the population that recorded not just numbers, but occupations, property holdings, and family relationships. This information allowed for more efficient taxation, better military organization, and improved urban planning. The census became a regular feature of Roman government, providing the detailed knowledge necessary to administer an increasingly complex society. Servius was also a great builder, though his projects focused on defense rather than spectacle. He constructed a new wall around Rome's expanded boundaries, encompassing all 7 hills in a fortification system so impressive that parts of it still stand today. This wall, nearly 7 miles long and incorporating the latest techniques in military engineering, made Rome virtually impregnable to assault. But perhaps the king's greatest innovation was constitutional. He established the Comitia Centuriata, an assembly in which all citizens could participate according to their class. This body could pass laws, elect magistrates, and even serve as a court for serious crimes. While the wealthy dominated its proceedings, the very existence of such an assembly established the principle that legitimate government required the consent of the governed. After 44 years of peaceful and prosperous rule, Servius met a violent end, murdered by his own daughter and son-in-law in their ambition to seize power. The manner of his death seemed to symbolize the end of an era. The next king would be Rome's last, and his tyrannical rule would so disgust the Roman people that they would banish kingship forever, establishing the republic that would conquer the Mediterranean world. As you sink deeper into the realm of dreams, imagine Rome at the end of the monarchical period. No longer a collection of huts on a single hill, it had become a proper city with stone walls, paved streets, temples, markets, and public buildings. Its population had grown from a few hundred outcasts to perhaps 50,000 citizens, making it one of the largest cities in Italy. The institutions that would guide its future expansion were already in place. The Senate to provide wisdom, the assemblies to represent the people, the priesthoods to maintain divine favor, and the laws to govern daily life. The seeds planted by Romulus had grown into a mighty tree, its roots drawing strength from the soil of central Italy, its branches reaching toward the wider Mediterranean world. Soon the monarchy would fall, the republic would rise, and Rome would begin its transformation from Italian city-state to master of the known world. But that is a story for the next phase of our journey through the Eternal City's magnificent history. The 7th and final king of Rome would prove to be the architect of his own dynasty's destruction. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, known to history as Tarquin the Proud, came to power through the murder of his predecessor and ruled through fear, arrogance, and contempt for the very institutions that had made Rome great. His reign would demonstrate that even the mightiest throne could not withstand the righteous anger of a free people pushed beyond endurance. Tarquin Superbus was the son of the earlier Etruscan king, but where his father had been a builder and innovator, the younger Tarquin was a destroyer of traditions. He dismissed the Senate's advice, ignored the people's assemblies, and ruled as an absolute monarch answerable to no one but himself. The careful balance between royal authority and citizen participation that had evolved over 2 centuries was swept away by his imperial ambitions. Yet for all his political failings, Tarquin was an effective military commander and a patron of grand projects. He completed the great temple of Jupiter that his father had begun, creating a magnificent shrine that proclaimed Rome's power to all who saw it. He extended Roman influence throughout Latium, bringing more cities under Roman control and expanding the territory that acknowledged Rome's supremacy. Under his rule, the city's wealth and power reached new heights, but power without legitimacy is a house built on sand, and Tarquin's tyranny bred the seeds of its own destruction. The king's treatment of the noble families grew increasingly harsh as he confiscated property, executed rivals, and elevated his own supporters, regardless of their merit. The ancient families that had guided Rome since its founding found themselves marginalized by a ruler who saw their influence as a threat to his absolute authority. The crisis that would topple the monarchy began not with grand politics, but with personal passion. Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, became obsessed with Lucretia, the virtuous wife of Lucius Junius Brutus's kinsman Collatinus. This noble woman embodied all the traditional Roman virtues: loyalty to her husband, devotion to her household, and unwavering moral integrity. Her very existence seemed to reproach the corruption that had infected the royal court. One evening, while the men were away on campaign, Sextus forced his way into Lucretia's home and violated her honor through violence and threats. The assault was not merely a personal crime, but an attack on the fundamental values that held Roman society together. A Roman matron's virtue was considered sacred, and its violation by a member of the royal family represented the ultimate corruption of power. When Lucretia revealed the assault to her husband and father, she made them swear to avenge her honor. Then, declaring that though she forgave herself the sin, she would not forgive herself the punishment, she drew a knife and plunged it into her heart. Her suicide was not an act of despair, but a deliberate sacrifice, a demonstration that death was preferable to dishonor, that some principles were worth more than life itself. The sight of Lucretia's blood crying out for justice transformed her kinsman Brutus from a seemingly harmless courtier into an avenging angel of Roman liberty. This man, who had survived Tarquin's suspicions by pretending to be simple-minded, now revealed the sharp intelligence he had kept hidden. Drawing the bloody knife from Lucretia's breast, he swore before the gods that he would drive the Tarquins from Rome and never again allow a king to rule over the Roman people. The conspiracy that followed moved with surprising speed and effectiveness. Brutus and his allies had been planning for this moment, waiting for the catalyst that would unite Roman opinion against the hated monarchy. Lucretia's death provided that catalyst, transforming what might have been seen as mere political ambition into a sacred crusade for justice and liberty. When news of the uprising reached Tarquin, he was campaigning against the city of Ardea. He rushed back to Rome with his army, only to find the city gates barred against him. From the walls, the citizens proclaimed their rejection of royal authority and their determination to live as free men under a government of laws rather than the whims of tyrants. The king, who had once commanded absolute obedience, now found himself in exile, reduced to begging foreign powers for assistance. The revolution of 509 BCE marked more than just a change of government. It represented a fundamental transformation in Roman political consciousness. The Romans didn't simply replace one king with another, as was common in the ancient world. Instead, they abolished monarchy entirely, creating something new under the sun: a republic, a government where supreme power rested not in a single individual, but in the collective will of the citizen body. The word republic comes from the Latin res publica, meaning the public thing, or the people's affair. This wasn't democracy as the Greeks practiced it, with direct participation by all citizens in decision-making. Rather, it was a representative system where the people elected magistrates to govern on their behalf, with elaborate checks and balances to prevent any individual from accumulating too much power. At the heart of the new system stood the consulship, an office that combined the executive authority of the old kings with crucial limitations designed to prevent tyranny. 2 consuls would be elected each year, each possessing the power to veto the other's decisions. They commanded the armies, presided over the Senate, and executed the laws, but they could not rule alone. and they could not rule for life. When their year in office ended, they returned to private life as ordinary citizens, subject to prosecution if they had abused their power. The Senate, which had served as an advisory body under the kings, now became the guiding institution of the Republic. Composed of former magistrates with lifetime tenure, the Senate provided continuity and wisdom to balance the energy and ambition of the annually elected officials. Though it lacked formal legislative power, its moral authority was so great that few magistrates dared act against its wishes. The Senate and people of Rome became the formula by which the state identified itself, acknowledging both the wisdom of experience and the sovereignty of the citizenry. Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had led the revolution against tyranny, became one of the first two consuls of the Roman Republic. His colleague was Lucius Junius Collatinus, the wronged husband whose wife's death had sparked the uprising. Together, they began the work of transforming revolutionary fervour into stable institutions capable of governing a complex society. But even the noblest revolutions faced the challenge of defending themselves against those who would restore the old order. Tarquin the Proud had not accepted his exile quietly. From his refuge among the Etruscans, he plotted his return, gathering allies who shared his hatred of the new republican government. Some of these allies were foreign kings who saw Rome's revolution as a dangerous example that might inspire their own subjects. Others were Romans who had prospered under royal favour and now found themselves marginalised by the new regime. The first test of the Republic came from within. A conspiracy was discovered among the young nobles of Rome, including Brutus's own sons, who had been seduced by promises of wealth and position if they helped restore the monarchy. The plot was betrayed by a slave, and the conspirators were arrested before they could act. The question now arose: how should the Republic deal with treason by its own citizens? The answer would establish one of the most fundamental principles of Roman governance, that the law applied equally to all citizens, regardless of their birth or connections. When the conspirators were brought to trial, not even family ties could save them. Brutus himself, as consul, was required to oversee the execution of his own sons for treason against the state. The ancient sources describe him sitting motionless as the axes fell, his face a mask of stoic determination, embodying the principle that duty to Rome transcended even the bonds of blood. This terrible scene established the Roman ideal of virtue that would inspire citizens for centuries to come. True greatness lay not in pursuing personal advantage, but in sacrificing oneself for the common good. The man who could put aside private grief for public duty, who could choose the harsh demands of justice over the soft promptings of sentiment, who could serve Rome even at the cost of his own happiness. This was the Roman hero, the citizen worthy of the Republic's freedom. With internal threats neutralized, the young Republic faced external challenges from those who sought to restore the monarchy by force. Lars Porsena, the powerful Etruscan king of Clusium, marched on Rome with a formidable army, determined to reinstall his fellow Etruscan Tarquin on the throne. The survival of the Republican experiment hung in the balance as enemy forces approached the city walls. The siege that followed became the stuff of legend, producing heroes whose names would be remembered as long as Rome endured. When Porsena's forces threatened to cross the Tiber via the wooden bridge that connected the city to the opposite bank, a young officer named Horatius Cocles volunteered for a desperate mission. While his comrades destroyed the bridge behind him, he would hold the enemy at the narrow crossing point, sacrificing his life to save the city. For what seemed like hours, Horatius stood alone against the Etruscan host, his shield deflecting their spears, his sword keeping them at bay through sheer skill and determination. When the bridge finally collapsed, Cutting off the enemy advance, he leaped fully armed into the raging Tiber and, by divine favor or incredible strength, managed to swim to safety. His heroism had saved Rome, but more than that, it had demonstrated the spirit that would make the Republic unconquerable. The siege continued with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. The Romans, secure behind their walls, could not drive off the attackers. The Etruscans, for all their numbers, could not breach the city's defences. It was then that a young Roman named Gaius Mucius attempted to break the deadlock through a daring assassination mission. Disguising himself as an Etruscan, he infiltrated Porsena's camp and attempted to kill the king. But in the confusion of the crowded royal tent, he struck down the wrong man, killing a secretary instead of his intended target. Captured and brought before Porsena for interrogation, Mucius demonstrated the Roman contempt for death that would become legendary throughout the ancient world. Rather than beg for mercy or reveal his mission, he thrust his right hand into the fire of a nearby altar and held it there without flinching as the flames consumed his flesh. "See how cheap the body is to men who have their eye on great glory," he declared. "There are 300 young Romans like me who have sworn to take your life. I was the first chosen by lot, but if I fail, another will follow, and then another, until one of us succeeds." Whether or not 300 such conspirators actually existed, Porsena was sufficiently impressed by this display of Roman determination to begin negotiations for peace. The siege was lifted in exchange for hostages and tribute, but more importantly, the Etruscan king recognized the Republic's right to exist. Rome had survived its first great test, emerging stronger and more confident in its destiny. The early decades of the Republic were marked by constant warfare as neighboring peoples tested the resolve of the new government. Some hoped that the fall of the monarchy had weakened Rome and made it vulnerable to conquest. Others feared that the revolutionary example might spread to their own territories and sought to crush it before it could inspire their subjects. In battle after battle, the citizen soldiers of Rome proved that free men fighting for their own liberty were more than a match for subjects compelled to serve by royal command. These conflicts established patterns that would characterize Roman expansion for centuries to come. Victory in war was followed not by simple plunder and withdrawal, but by the incorporation of defeated enemies into the Roman system. Some were granted full citizenship, others received partial rights, and still others became allies bound by treaty to Rome. This policy of graduated inclusion created a growing network of communities with stakes in Roman success, providing the manpower and resources that would fuel future expansion. The internal development of the Republic proceeded alongside its external growth. The early years saw the creation of new magistracies to handle the increasing complexity of government. Praetors were established to administer justice, quaestors to manage finances, and censors to conduct the population surveys that determined military service and voting rights. Each office had its specific powers and limitations, creating a web of mutual checks that prevented any individual from dominating the system. Yet for all its innovations, the early Republic remained dominated by the patrician families, who could trace their ancestry back to the original Senate appointed by Romulus. These nobles monopolized the major offices, controlled religious ceremonies, and interpreted the laws according to their own interests. The majority of citizens, known as plebeians, found themselves excluded from real political power despite their service in the armies and their contributions to the state's wealth. This tension between the orders would dominate Roman politics for the next 2 centuries, as the plebeians fought for political equality while the patricians struggled to maintain their privileged position. The conflict would be resolved not through revolution, but through gradual reform, demonstrating the Roman genius for adapting institutions to changing circumstances rather than clinging rigidly to outdated traditions. As you surrender more completely to sleep's embrace, picture Rome in these early Republican years. A city of perhaps 100,000 inhabitants, its hills crowned with temples and public buildings, its streets bustling with citizens who walked as free men rather than subjects. The 7 hills that had once sheltered a handful of outcasts now supported a sophisticated urban civilization, complete with aqueducts bringing fresh water from distant mountains, sewers carrying away waste, and markets offering goods from across the Mediterranean world. This was no longer the Rome of Romulus, built by desperate refugees and populated through the seizure of Sabine women. This was a confident republic, secure in its institutions, proud of its traditions, and convinced of its destiny to bring order and justice to a chaotic world. The transformation from monarchy to republic had been more than a change of government. It had been a revolution in human consciousness, demonstrating that men could govern themselves through reason and law, rather than submitting to the arbitrary will of kings. The stage was now set for the great expansion that would transform Rome from an Italian city-state into the master of the Mediterranean world. The institutions were in place, the military traditions established, the political culture defined. All that remained was for the right combination of ambition, opportunity, and necessity to set in motion the conquest that would bring 3 continents under Roman rule. But that expansion would not come easily or quickly. It would require centuries of warfare, diplomacy, and adaptation. It would demand sacrifices from generation after generation of Roman citizens. It would test every institution the Republic had created and force constant evolution in law, government, and society. Through it all, the spirit born in that first revolution against tyranny would endure. The belief that free citizens serving the common good could accomplish what no king or emperor could achieve through force alone. The republic that emerged from the ashes of the monarchy was Rome's greatest creation, more enduring than its roads, more influential than its laws, more transformative than its conquests. In establishing the principle that government derived its authority from the consent of the governed, that power should be limited and temporary, that justice should be blind to rank and birth, the Romans created ideas that would outlive their empire and continue to shape human civilization long after the last legion had marched and the final emperor had fallen. The early decades of the Roman Republic tested every institution the revolutionaries had created. Like a young tree weathering its first storms, the new government bent under pressure but refused to break. Each crisis that arose, and there were many, forced the Romans to adapt, to refine their systems, to discover through trial and error what worked and what didn't in governing a free people. The greatest internal challenge came not from foreign enemies, but from within Roman society itself. The patricians, those noble families who claimed descent from Romulus's original senators, had initially embraced the Republic because it freed them from royal tyranny. But they quickly discovered that popular government posed its own threats to their privileged position. Without a king to serve as the ultimate authority, political power became a prize to be competed for, and the plebeians, the common citizens who formed the backbone of Roman society, began to demand their share. The conflict between these two orders would define Roman politics for the next 2 centuries. It began simply enough, with plebeian complaints about debt laws that reduced free citizens to virtual slavery when they couldn't pay their creditors. It escalated when plebeians realized they were excluded from the major magistracies, barred from the priesthoods, and forbidden to marry into patrician families, despite their service in the armies that defended the state. The crisis came to a head in 494 BCE, just 15 years after the founding of the Republic. The plebeians, pushed beyond endurance by economic hardship and political exclusion, did something unprecedented in the ancient world. They went on strike. But this wasn't a modern labor dispute. It was a complete withdrawal from Roman society. The plebeians marched out of the city en masse and established their own community on the Sacred Mount, a hill outside Rome's boundaries. Picture the patricians waking up one morning to find the city half empty. The shops were closed, the markets silent, the construction projects abandoned. Worse still, the army camps were nearly deserted, as the common soldiers who formed the backbone of Rome's military might had departed with their civilian counterparts. Without the plebeians, Rome couldn't function economically, couldn't defend itself militarily, and couldn't maintain the civic life that distinguished it from barbarian settlements. The patricians tried everything to break the strike. They sent messengers promising reforms. They threatened legal action. They even attempted to recruit armies from Rome's allies. Nothing worked. The plebeians had discovered their collective power and refused to return until their grievances were addressed. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, possibly leading to the collapse of the young republic, had not a wise patrician named Menenius Agrippa found a way to bridge the divide. Agrippa went to the Sacred Mount, not as a representative of the government, but as a storyteller, and the tale he told became one of the most famous fables in Roman history. He compared Roman society to a human body, with each part playing its essential role. The stomach, he said, might seem to do nothing but consume the food that the hands gathered and the mouth chewed, but without the stomach's work of distribution, the entire body would die. Just so, the patricians might appear to live in luxury while the plebeians laboured, but their role in governance and religious duties was essential to the state's survival. Whether it was Agrippa's eloquence or simply exhaustion from the standoff, his words broke the deadlock. But the plebeians didn't simply return to their old position of subservience. They had learned their power and extracted concrete concessions in exchange for ending their strike. Most importantly, they won the right to elect their own magistrates, called tribunes of the plebs, who could protect plebeian interests against patrician oppression. These tribunes possessed an extraordinary power that would shape Roman politics for centuries, the right of veto. A tribune could literally stand up in the Senate, the popular assemblies, or even before a magistrate and cry veto, meaning I forbid, stopping any action he deemed harmful to plebeian interests. Their persons were declared sacred and inviolable. Anyone who harmed a tribune faced religious condemnation and likely death at the hands of an angry mob. The creation of the tribunate marked the beginning of a long evolution that would gradually democratize the Roman Republic. It established the principle that legitimate government required not just the consent of the elite, but the active participation of all citizens. More practically, it gave the plebeians a tool to force further reforms when the patricians proved reluctant to share power voluntarily. The next major breakthrough came with the creation of the 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code. Before this, legal procedures had been the secret knowledge of patrician magistrates and priests, who could interpret them to favour their own class. The plebeians demanded that the laws be written down and displayed publicly, where every citizen could read them and understand his rights and obligations. The process of creating this code was itself a testament to Roman pragmatism. Rather than relying solely on their own traditions, the Romans sent a commission to study the laws of other peoples, particularly the Greek city-states, whose legal systems were considered among the most advanced in the ancient world. The commissioners returned with ideas that were adapted to Roman conditions and combined with existing customs to create something entirely new. The 12 Tables, when they were finally completed and displayed in the Forum around 450 BCE, represented a revolution in legal thinking. For the first time in Roman history, the law was no longer the mysterious province of priests and nobles, but the public property of all citizens. A farmer could know exactly what constituted theft, a merchant could understand the rules governing contracts, and a father could comprehend his authority over his household. The laws themselves were harsh by modern standards, reflecting the brutal realities of ancient life. They permitted a creditor to dismember a debtor who couldn't pay his obligations, allowed a father to sell his children into slavery, and prescribed death for numerous offences that we would consider minor. But they were applied equally to all citizens, regardless of birth or wealth, and they could be changed only through established procedures rather than the whim of magistrates. More importantly, the 12 Tables established principles that would influence legal thinking for millennia. They recognized the presumption of innocence, required evidence for conviction, and established the right of appeal to the popular assemblies. They created standardized procedures for everything from marriage and divorce to property ownership and inheritance. Most fundamentally, they enshrined the idea that law should be rational, predictable, and accessible to all citizens. With written laws in place, the plebeians continued their gradual advance toward political equality. In 445 BCE, they won the right to marry patricians, breaking down one of the most important barriers between the classes. Children of these mixed marriages could choose which parent's status to inherit, gradually blurring the rigid distinction between patrician and plebeian families. The next target was the consulship itself, the highest office in the Roman state. For decades, patricians had monopolized this position, arguing that their noble birth and religious authority made them uniquely qualified to lead. The plebeians countered that merit and popular support should determine fitness for office, not accidents of ancestry. The compromise that emerged was typically Roman in its practical wisdom. The consulship would be temporarily replaced by a board of military tribunes with consular power, positions that plebeians could hold. This arrangement lasted for nearly a century, during which capable plebeians proved they could govern as effectively as their patrician counterparts. When the consulship was finally restored in 367 BCE, it came with the requirement that one of the two consuls must be a plebeian. This Licinian Sextian legislation, named after the tribunes who proposed it, opened the door to full plebeian participation in Roman government. The pattern established by these reforms would repeat throughout Roman history. Initial resistance from the elite, pressure from below, compromise solutions that gradually expanded participation while preserving essential structures. Rather than revolutionary upheaval that destroyed existing institutions, Rome evolved through incremental change that maintained stability while adapting to new circumstances. As plebeians gained political rights, they also assumed political responsibilities. Wealthy plebeians began to behave much like patricians, seeking offices, building grand houses, and competing for status and influence. The old division between patrician and plebeian gradually gave way to a new distinction between the optimates, the best people drawn from both orders, and the populares, politicians who appealed to the broader citizenry for support. This transformation of Roman society paralleled the city's growing influence throughout Italy. The early republic faced constant warfare as neighboring peoples tested its strength and resolve. Some conflicts arose from raids and border disputes, others from larger strategic considerations, as various Italian tribes and cities sought to prevent Roman dominance of the peninsula. The Romans approached these conflicts with the same pragmatic flexibility they showed in domestic politics. Victory in war was followed not by simple conquest, but by carefully negotiated settlements that integrated defeated enemies into the Roman system. Some communities received full Roman citizenship. Others became allies with defined rights and obligations. And still others were granted Latin rights that provided most of the benefits of citizenship without political participation in Roman assemblies. This policy of graduated inclusion created a network of communities throughout Italy with stakes in Roman success. When Rome went to war, it could call upon not just its own citizens, but hundreds of thousands of allies who provided troops, supplies, and strategic support. The diversity of this alliance system became one of Rome's greatest strengths, as different communities contributed their particular specialties: Gallic cavalry, Balearic slingers, Greek engineers, to create military forces more versatile than any single people could field. The conquest of Italy was neither swift nor easy. It required nearly 3 centuries of almost constant warfare, punctuated by temporary setbacks that might have destroyed a less resilient state. The worst crisis came in 390 BCE, when a Celtic army led by Brennus defeated the Romans at the Battle of the Allia and proceeded to sack Rome itself. For months, Gallic warriors occupied the city while Roman survivors held out on the Capitoline Hill, reduced to near starvation as their enemies systematically looted everything of value. The psychological impact of this disaster was enormous. For the first time since the founding of the Republic, foreign enemies had walked through Roman streets, burned Roman temples, and carried off Roman treasures. The humiliation was so complete that some Romans spoke of abandoning their ruined city and starting over elsewhere. But the crisis also demonstrated the resilience that would carry Rome through many future disasters. Rather than despair, the Romans rebuilt. They constructed new walls, stronger and higher than before. They reformed their military tactics, learning from their defeat to develop more flexible fighting methods. They renewed their alliances with neighboring communities, often on more generous terms than before. Most importantly, they refused to let one defeat, however devastating, shake their confidence in their ultimate destiny. The recovery from the Gallic sack marked the beginning of Rome's systematic expansion throughout the Italian peninsula. Over the next century, Roman armies campaigned against the Samnites in the mountains of central Italy, the Greek cities of the south, and the remaining Gallic tribes in the north. Each victory brought new territory under Roman control and new peoples into the Roman alliance system. The Samnite Wars were particularly important because they tested Roman endurance and strategic thinking over decades of conflict. The Samnites were tough mountain warriors who used guerrilla tactics and defensive positions to neutralize Roman advantages in equipment and discipline. The wars dragged on for nearly 50 years, with victories and defeats on both sides. Temporary truces followed by renewed fighting, and moments when Rome's very survival seemed in doubt. The most famous incident occurred at the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, when an entire Roman army was trapped in a mountain pass and forced to surrender. The Samnites made the Romans pass under the yoke, crawling beneath crossed spears in a ritual humiliation that symbolized their complete defeat. But rather than ending Roman resistance, this humiliation only strengthened Roman determination to continue the fight until victory was achieved. The eventual Roman triumph over the Samnites demonstrated several characteristics that would define their approach to empire building. First was their refusal to accept defeat as permanent. Where other peoples might have negotiated after suffering such a humiliation, the Romans simply rebuilt their armies and resumed fighting. Second was their ability to learn from their enemies, adopting Samnite weapons and tactics that proved superior to their own traditional methods. Third was their long-term strategic thinking, maintaining pressure over decades until their opponents were finally exhausted. By 270 BCE, Roman authority extended from the Po Valley in the north to the Greek cities of southern Italy. The peninsula that had once been divided among dozens of independent peoples was now united under Roman leadership, though not Roman rule. The genius of the Roman system lay in its flexibility. Different communities enjoyed different relationships with Rome, creating a complex network of obligations and privileges that bound the peninsula together while preserving local identities. This Italian confederation would prove to be Rome's greatest asset in the trials that lay ahead. When Hannibal crossed the Alps with his elephants and veteran troops, when Mithridates challenged Roman power in the east, when civil wars threatened to tear the Republic apart, the loyalty of Rome's Italian allies provided the manpower and resources that ultimately guaranteed survival and victory. But the conquest of Italy was only the beginning. As Roman power reached the shores of the Mediterranean, it inevitably came into contact with other great powers who ruled the ancient world. Carthage controlled the western Mediterranean from its bases in North Africa and Spain. The Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedonia, Syria, Egypt, were the heirs of Alexander the Great's empire in the east. These were not Italian hill tribes that could be defeated in a few campaigns, but sophisticated civilizations with vast resources, professional armies, and centuries of experience in great power politics. The collision between Rome and these Mediterranean empires would determine the future of the ancient world. Would Rome remain an Italian regional power, or would it expand its alliance system across 3 continents? Would the Roman Republic citizen soldiers prove capable of defeating professional armies led by experienced generals? Could Roman institutions adapt to governing diverse populations speaking different languages and following different customs? As you drift deeper into sleep's embrace, imagine Rome at this crucial moment in its history. The city that had begun as a refuge for outcasts now commanded the loyalty of millions throughout Italy. Its temples gleamed with marble, its forums bustled with commerce, its schools trained young men in rhetoric and law. The institutions created by Brutus and his fellow revolutionaries had evolved to accommodate a complex society while preserving the essential principle of popular government. Yet for all its achievements, the Roman Republic remained untested against the greatest challenges that awaited it. The wars that would establish Rome as the dominant Mediterranean power lay just ahead. Conflicts that would strain every institution, test every alliance, and demand sacrifices that would transform both the victors and the vanquished. The greatest chapter in Rome's story was about to begin, and the world would never be the same. The Mediterranean beckoned like a vast stage awaiting its greatest drama. Rome had conquered Italy through a combination of military prowess and political genius. But beyond the familiar shores of the peninsula lay powers that dwarfed anything the Romans had yet encountered. These were not tribal chieftains ruling from hilltop fortresses, but ancient civilizations with fleets that commanded the seas, armies that had marched with Alexander, and treasuries filled with the wealth of continents. Chief among these rivals stood Carthage, the great merchant empire that had grown from a Phoenician trading post into the master of the Western Mediterranean. From its magnificent capital on the North African coast, Carthage controlled a commercial network that stretched from the Atlantic shores of Spain to the trading posts of Sicily. Its ships carried Spanish silver, African ivory, and exotic goods from beyond the known world. Its armies, led by professional generals and staffed with mercenaries from a dozen nations, had never known defeat at the hands of a Western power. The Carthaginians looked upon Rome's rise with the calculating eyes of experienced merchants. Here was a new power disrupting the established order, threatening trade routes that had enriched Carthage for centuries. The Romans, for their part, gazed across the narrow straits that separated Sicily from Italy and saw an island that commanded the sea lanes between east and west. Neither power could allow the other to dominate such a strategic position. The spark that ignited 3 wars between these titans came from an unlikely source. A band of Italian mercenaries calling themselves the Mamertines had seized the Sicilian city of Messana through treachery and violence. When Syracuse, the greatest Greek city in Sicily, moved to expel these brigands, the Mamertines found themselves trapped between the advancing Syracusans and the sea. In desperation, they sent ambassadors both to Carthage and to Rome, offering to surrender their city to whichever power would protect them from destruction. For the Romans, this request posed a dilemma that would echo through the centuries. The Mamertines were hardly worthy allies, thieves and murderers who had stolen a city through bloodshed. Yet Messana controlled the narrow strait between Sicily and Italy, a position of such strategic importance that its possession by either Carthage or Syracuse would threaten Rome's security forever. After intense debate in the Senate, the Romans made the fateful decision to accept the Mamertines' offer, setting in motion events that would transform them from Italian regional power to Mediterranean empire. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE, with Roman legions crossing to Sicily for the first time in their history. These citizen soldiers, accustomed to fighting in the familiar hills and valleys of Italy, now found themselves on foreign soil, facing enemies whose tactics and equipment were unlike anything they had encountered. The Carthaginian forces included not only African troops from around Carthage itself, but Spanish swordsmen, Gallic warriors, Balearic slingers, and Numidian cavalry, whose mobility and skill had made them legendary throughout the ancient world. Yet the Romans possessed advantages that their enemies initially underestimated. Where Carthaginian armies were composed of mercenaries fighting for pay, Roman legions consisted of citizens defending their homeland and their way of life. The Carthaginian generals, for all their professional skill, commanded men whose loyalty could be bought by the highest bidder. Roman commanders led soldiers whose families, property, and future depended on victory. The early campaigns in Sicily revealed both the strengths and limitations of the opposing forces. Roman infantry, with their disciplined formations and standardized equipment, proved superior in pitched battles on level ground. But the Carthaginians controlled the seas, allowing them to supply their forces, evacuate threatened positions, and strike at Roman communications. The war quickly settled into a pattern of Roman advances inland and Carthaginian dominance of the coastline. It was during this first great overseas war that the Romans made one of the most audacious decisions in military history. Recognizing that they could never achieve decisive victory while Carthage controlled the sea lanes, they resolved to build a navy from scratch. This was no small undertaking for a people whose maritime experience had been limited to river crossings and coastal trading. The Romans had no tradition of naval warfare, no experienced admirals, no shipyards capable of constructing war galleys on the scale required. But they approached this challenge with the same pragmatic determination that had carried them through previous crises. When a Carthaginian warship ran aground on the Italian coast, Roman craftsmen dismantled it piece by piece, studying its construction and creating templates that allowed them to build copies. Within months, shipyards throughout Italy were producing vessels modelled on Carthaginian designs, while Roman citizens who had never seen the open ocean learned the arts of seamanship and naval combat. The Romans compensated for their inexperience at sea with an innovation that transformed naval warfare. They equipped their ships with a device called the corvus, a hinged boarding bridge that could be dropped onto an enemy vessel, allowing Roman soldiers to charge across and fight on the enemy deck as if they were on land. This invention neutralized the Carthaginian advantage in ship handling and seamanship by turning naval battles into infantry combats, where Roman discipline and training gave them the edge. The first great naval victory came at Mylae in 260 BCE, where the Roman fleet under Gaius Duilius defeated a Carthaginian squadron that had approached with supreme confidence, expecting to scatter these amateur sailors like leaves before the wind. Instead, they found their ships grappled by the Corvus and boarded by Roman marines who fought with all the fury of legionaries defending their homeland. The victory sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean world, announcing that Rome had become a naval power capable of challenging Carthage on its own element. Yet the sea remained a harsh teacher for the Roman navy. Storms that experienced Mediterranean sailors might have avoided or weathered destroyed entire Roman fleets. The worst disaster occurred in 255 BCE, when a fleet of over 350 ships was caught in a tempest off the African coast. Only 80 vessels survived, and with them died thousands of Roman citizens who had entrusted their lives to commanders still learning the dangers of the deep waters. The Romans rebuilt their fleets again and again, accepting losses that would have discouraged less determined peoples. They developed new ship designs, trained new crews, and refined their tactics through the harsh experience of repeated disaster and gradual success. By the war's end, Roman naval power had become so formidable that Carthage, the ancient master of the seas, found its own coastline blockaded by the descendants of Italian farmers. The land campaigns in Sicily proved equally instructive in the Roman method of warfare. Rather than seeking quick victories through brilliant maneuvers, Roman commanders pursued a strategy of systematic reduction. They besieged Carthaginian strongholds with methodical patience, built fortified camps that became permanent bases, and gradually extended their control over the island's interior. This approach required enormous resources and unwavering determination, but it suited the Roman character and their superior ability to sustain long campaigns through citizen levies. The siege of Lilybaeum exemplified this Roman approach to warfare. This heavily fortified Carthaginian base on Sicily's western coast had withstood attacks by previous conquerors, its massive walls and excellent harbour making it virtually impregnable to conventional assault. The Romans invested the city with a ring of fortifications and settled down for what they knew would be a lengthy siege. For years the blockade continued, with Roman engineers constantly devising new methods to breach the defences, while Carthaginian defenders found equally ingenious ways to repair the damage and maintain their resistance. The psychological impact of such persistence was as important as its military effect. Throughout the Mediterranean world, rulers and generals began to understand that Rome represented a new kind of enemy, one that would not be discouraged by temporary setbacks or the prospect of long campaigns. This reputation for relentless determination would serve Rome well in future conflicts, as opponents increasingly chose negotiation over the prospect of facing Roman persistence in extended warfare. The First Punic War finally ended in 241 BCE with a decisive Roman naval victory at the Aegates Islands, where the last Carthaginian fleet attempting to supply their forces in Sicily was destroyed by Roman ships that had learned to match their enemies in seamanship while retaining their advantage in boarding combat. Carthage, exhausted by decades of warfare and facing rebellions among its unpaid mercenaries, sued for peace on terms that established Rome as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The peace treaty required Carthage to evacuate Sicily entirely, pay a massive indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, and promise not to make war on Rome's allies. More significantly, the settlement established the principle that would guide Roman expansion for centuries to come. Defeated enemies must not only cease their aggression, but also provide the resources that would enable Rome to fight future wars. Each victory would finance the next campaign, creating a self-sustaining cycle of conquest that could continue as long as enemies remained to be defeated. For Rome, the victory brought more than territorial gain and financial reward. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, a territory governed directly by Roman magistrates rather than incorporated into the Italian alliance system. This innovation required new forms of administration, new legal procedures for governing people who were not Roman citizens, and new methods of extracting revenue from conquered territories. The experience gained in governing Sicily would prove invaluable when Rome began acquiring provinces throughout the Mediterranean world. The war had also transformed Roman society in ways that would have profound consequences for the future. The enormous costs of building and maintaining fleets had strained the traditional system of citizen soldiers serving at their own expense. Increasingly, the state had to provide equipment and pay for extended campaigns, beginning the transition from a militia-based army to a professional military force. The wealth flowing in from Sicily and the indemnity payments created new opportunities for enrichment among the Roman elite, while the common citizens who had borne the burden of military service began to expect material rewards for their sacrifices. Perhaps most importantly, victory over Carthage had given Rome confidence that it could defeat any enemy, no matter how powerful or experienced. The psychological transformation was as significant as the territorial gains. Romans began to see themselves not merely as the dominant power in Italy, but as the potential masters of the entire Mediterranean world. This shift in perspective would drive the next phase of expansion, as Roman armies marched east to challenge the Hellenistic kingdoms that ruled the lands conquered by Alexander the Great. But Carthage had not accepted its defeat as permanent. In the Spanish territories that remained under Carthaginian control, a new generation of leaders was emerging who viewed the First Punic War not as a decisive settlement, but as merely the first round in a longer struggle. Chief among these was Hamilcar Barca, the brilliant general who had never been defeated in Sicily and who now devoted his energies to building a new base of Carthaginian power in Spain. Hamilcar understood that Carthage's defeat had resulted from its reliance on mercenary armies and its failure to develop the kind of citizen loyalty that made Rome so formidable. In Spain, he began creating something unprecedented in Carthaginian history: a territorial empire based on direct rule rather than commercial relationships. Spanish silver would replace the wealth lost in Sicily. Spanish manpower would provide armies loyal to Carthage rather than merely fighting for pay, and Spanish territory would serve as a base for the eventual reconquest of Carthaginian supremacy. The Romans, focused on consolidating their gains in Sicily and expanding their influence in the eastern Mediterranean, initially paid little attention to these developments in distant Spain. This neglect would prove to be one of the most costly mistakes in Roman history, as the power being built beyond the Pyrenees would soon march over the Alps to threaten Rome's very existence. As you sink deeper into the peaceful realm of dreams, imagine the Mediterranean world at this pivotal moment. Rome had announced its arrival as a great power through victory over Carthage, but the full implications of this triumph were not yet clear. The Romans themselves could hardly have imagined that within a generation their armies would be marching through the streets of Greek cities that had flourished since before Rome's founding, or that Roman governors would be ruling territories that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. The First Punic War had been like a stone thrown into a still pond, its ripples spreading outward to disturb the established order throughout the ancient world. Kings and generals from Gaul to Egypt were reassessing their strategies and alliances in light of this new Roman power. Some sought to ally themselves with the rising force, others began preparing to resist it, but none could ignore it. The age of Roman expansion had begun, and the world would never be the same. The 23 years of peace that followed the First Punic War were deceptive in their apparent tranquility. While Rome consolidated its control over Sicily and extended its influence through diplomatic means, the seeds of an even greater conflict were being sown in the mountains of Spain and the political councils of Carthage. The peace had not resolved the fundamental rivalry between the two powers. It had merely provided time for both sides to prepare for a more decisive confrontation. The Second Great War between Rome and Carthage would not begin with territorial disputes or trade conflicts, but with the personal ambition of one man and the burning desire for revenge that had smouldered in Carthaginian hearts since their humiliating defeat. In the rugged mountains of Spain, far from the comfortable halls of Roman power, Hamilcar Barca was forging a weapon that would strike at the very heart of the Roman Republic. Hamilcar had brought his young son Hannibal to Spain when the boy was barely 9 years old. At the altar of Baal, the Carthaginian god of war, the father made his son swear a sacred oath that he would never be a friend to Rome. This was no mere childhood ceremony, but a solemn dedication to a life of enmity that would shape the course of history. The boy who placed his small hand on the sacrificial victim and spoke those fateful words would grow to become Rome's most dangerous enemy, a military genius whose very name would strike terror into Roman hearts for generations. Under Hamilcar's guidance, and later under his son-in-law Hasdrubal, Carthaginian power in Spain grew steadily. The native tribes were conquered or allied through a combination of military force and diplomatic skill. Rich silver mines provided the wealth necessary to maintain large armies, while Spanish warriors proved eager to serve under Carthaginian banners in exchange for regular pay and the promise of plunder. What emerged was not merely a Carthaginian colony, but a new kind of territorial empire, one that could challenge Rome's growing dominance. The Romans watched these developments with growing unease. The treaty ending the First Punic War had said nothing about Spain, leaving Carthage free to expand its influence there without violating the terms of peace. But as Carthaginian power grew, so did Roman concerns about the strategic implications. A strong Carthaginian base in Spain could threaten Roman interests in southern Gaul, disrupt trade routes, and provide a platform for future attacks on Roman territory. The crisis that would trigger renewed war came from an unexpected source. The Greek city of Saguntum, located on Spain's eastern coast well within the Carthaginian sphere of influence, appealed to Rome for protection against Carthaginian pressure. The Romans, perhaps unwisely, accepted this appeal and declared Saguntum to be under their protection. This decision placed a Roman protectorate deep within territory that Carthage considered its own, creating an impossible situation that could only be resolved through war. When Hannibal, now commanding Carthaginian forces in Spain following his father's and brother-in-law's deaths, laid siege to Saguntum in 219 BCE, he knew he was crossing a line that would lead to renewed conflict with Rome. The city's desperate appeals for Roman assistance went unanswered as the siege dragged on for 8 months. Roman promises of protection proved empty when the moment of crisis arrived, and Saguntum fell to Carthaginian assault with its population sold into slavery and its wealth added to Hannibal's war chest. The Roman response was swift but predictable. Ambassadors were sent to Carthage demanding Hannibal's surrender for punishment. When the Carthaginian Senate refused, one of the Roman envoys dramatically gathered his toga into a fold and declared that within its folds he carried both peace and war. Carthage could choose which it preferred. The Carthaginian response was equally theatrical. "Give us whichever you wish." "Then take war," replied the Roman, shaking out his toga as if releasing the furies that would soon ravage the ancient world. But Hannibal had no intention of waiting for Rome to bring the war to him. Throughout the winter of 218 BCE, he prepared for the most audacious military campaign in ancient history. Rather than meeting Roman forces in Spain or awaiting their arrival by sea, he would march his army overland through Gaul and across the Alps, bringing the war directly to Italy itself. The plan was so bold as to seem impossible, which was precisely why it might succeed. The army that set out from New Carthage in the spring of 218 BCE was unlike any force that had ever attempted such a march. It included nearly 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry drawn from across the Carthaginian Empire. Spanish swordsmen marched alongside African spearmen, Gallic warriors beside Numidian horsemen. Most famously, the force included 37 war elephants, massive beasts trained for battle, whose presence alone could scatter enemy formations and whose symbolic value proclaimed Hannibal's determination to achieve the impossible. The march through Spain proceeded smoothly enough, as most of the territory was already under Carthaginian control. But when Hannibal's army reached the Pyrenees, it entered the unknown. The Gallic tribes beyond the mountains were fierce and independent, with no love for any foreign army crossing their territory. Some fought desperately against the invaders, others demanded tribute for safe passage, and still others agreed to provide guides and supplies in exchange for promises of plunder when the army reached Italy. As the army moved deeper into Gaul, its numbers began to dwindle. Some troops were left behind to garrison strategic points, others deserted rather than face the unknown perils ahead, and many fell in skirmishes with hostile tribes. By the time Hannibal reached the Rhone River, his force had been reduced to perhaps 60,000 men, still formidable, but no longer the overwhelming host that had departed from Spain. The crossing of the Rhone presented the first major obstacle to Hannibal's advance. The river was wide and swift, defended by Gallic tribes on the far shore who were determined to prevent the Carthaginian army from proceeding. Most challenging of all was the problem of getting the elephants across the water. These massive creatures, already stressed by the long march through unfamiliar territory, panicked at the sight of the rushing water and refused to board the rafts constructed for their transport. Hannibal's solution demonstrated the ingenuity that made him one of history's greatest generals. He had his men construct sturdy rafts covered with earth and vegetation to create the illusion of solid ground. The elephants, deceived by this ruse, walked calmly onto what they believed was merely an extension of the riverbank. Once the rafts were pushed into the current, some of the terrified animals jumped overboard, but their natural buoyancy and the guidance of their handlers allowed most to swim safely to the opposite shore. The crossing achieved, Hannibal turned north toward the Alps, following routes known only to local guides whose loyalty had been purchased with gold and promises. The Romans, meanwhile, had finally awakened to the magnitude of the threat approaching Italy. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had been preparing to invade Spain, redirected his forces to intercept Hannibal in southern Gaul. But when the Roman army arrived at the Rhone, they found only abandoned campsites and the trampled ground where 60,000 men and their animals had passed. The race was now on. Scipio, realizing he could not catch Hannibal's army before it reached the Alps, made a crucial strategic decision. He sent most of his forces to Spain under his brother's command, while he himself returned to Italy to prepare defenses against Hannibal's arrival. This division of Roman forces would prove to be exactly what Hannibal had hoped for, preventing the Romans from concentrating their full strength against his invasion. The Alpine crossing that followed became the stuff of legend, an achievement so remarkable that it has inspired artists and writers for over 2,000 years. Modern historians still debate the exact route Hannibal followed, but all agree that no army before or since has accomplished anything comparable. The mountain passes were treacherous even in good weather, with narrow paths that wound along precipitous cliffs where a single misstep could send men and animals plunging to their deaths. As autumn progressed toward winter, conditions became increasingly desperate. Snow began to fall, making the rocky paths slippery and dangerous. Supplies ran low as the army moved through barren mountain regions where little food could be found. The local tribes, seeing the Carthaginian force weakened by its ordeal, launched attacks on the column, rolling boulders down mountainsides and ambushing stragglers who fell behind the main body. The elephants suffered terribly in the cold mountain air. These creatures of the African plains were never meant to endure freezing temperatures and alpine conditions. One by one, they sickened and died, their massive corpses left behind on the mountain trails as mute testimony to the price of Hannibal's ambition. By the time the army finally descended into the Po Valley, only a single elephant remained alive, a beast that Hannibal himself would ride into battle as a symbol of his incredible journey. When the Carthaginian army finally emerged from the Alps in late 218 BCE, it was a shadow of the force that had departed from Spain. Perhaps 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry had survived the terrible crossing, their ranks thinned by cold, hunger, disease, and enemy action. Many of the survivors were wounded or weakened, barely able to continue the march. Yet, for all their suffering, they had achieved something unprecedented in military history. They had transported an army across the Alps and stood ready to challenge Rome in its own heartland. The psychological impact of Hannibal's arrival in Italy was as significant as its military implications. For centuries, Romans had grown accustomed to fighting their wars on foreign soil, secure in the knowledge that their homeland was protected by the sea and the Alps. Now, suddenly, enemy campfires burned in the Po Valley, while Carthaginian cavalry raided within sight of Roman cities. The impossible had become reality, and Rome found itself facing a crisis unlike any in its history. Hannibal's first priority was rebuilding his army's strength after the devastating Alpine crossing. The Gallic tribes of northern Italy, many of whom had been recently conquered by Rome and bore grudges against their new masters, proved eager to join the Carthaginian cause. Warriors flocked to Hannibal's standards, drawn by his reputation for generosity to allies and his promise to liberate them from Roman rule. Within weeks, the Carthaginian force had swollen to over 40,000 men. Though many of the new recruits lacked the training and equipment of professional soldiers, the Romans, meanwhile, scrambled to organize their defenses. The consul Scipio, who had rushed back from Gaul, gathered what forces he could and moved north to confront the invaders. The two armies met at the Tichinus River in November 218 BCE, where Hannibal demonstrated the tactical brilliance that would make him Rome's most feared enemy. Using his superior cavalry to outflank the Roman position, he inflicted a sharp defeat on Scipio's forces and wounded the consul himself, who was saved from death only by the courage of his teenage son, the future Scipio Africanus, who would one day defeat Hannibal at Zama. This initial victory brought more Gallic tribes to Hannibal's cause and established his reputation as an invincible general. The Romans, shaken by their defeat, withdrew south of the Po River and called for reinforcements from throughout Italy. The second consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, marched north with a fresh army, confident that Roman discipline and numbers would overwhelm the invaders despite their initial success. The Battle of the Trebia River in December 218 BCE revealed the full extent of Hannibal's tactical genius. Recognizing that Roman commanders were eager for battle and prone to overconfidence, he devised an elaborate trap. On a cold winter morning, he sent his Numidian cavalry to attack the Roman camp, drawing Sempronius and his legions across the icy river in pursuit. The Romans, wet and cold from their river crossing, found themselves facing not only Hannibal's main army, but also a hidden force of Carthaginian infantry that struck them from behind after emerging from concealment along the riverbank. The result was a catastrophic Roman defeat. Of the 40,000 Romans who had crossed the Trebia that morning, fewer than 10,000 made it back to safety. The rest were killed or captured in the worst military disaster Rome had suffered since the Gallic sack of the city 3 centuries earlier. News of the defeat sent shockwaves throughout Italy and the Mediterranean world. Rome, which had seemed invincible after its victory in the First Punic War, suddenly appeared vulnerable to an enemy who had materialized from nowhere to strike at the heart of Roman power. The winter that followed was one of the darkest in Roman history. Hannibal's army, strengthened by victory and reinforced by Gallic allies, controlled much of northern Italy. Roman forces had been scattered or destroyed, and no effective resistance seemed possible against the Carthaginian advance. Throughout Italy, Rome's allies began to waver in their loyalty, wondering whether it might be wise to accommodate themselves to this new power that had appeared so suddenly in their midst. Yet even in this moment of supreme crisis, Rome's institutions held firm. Rather than suing for peace or abandoning the struggle, the Romans prepared for a longer and more difficult war than any they had previously fought. New armies were raised, new strategies developed, and new commanders chosen to face an enemy who had already proved his mastery of conventional warfare. The stage was set for a conflict that would test every aspect of Roman civilization and determine whether the Republic could survive the greatest military challenge in its history. As you drift deeper into sleep's embrace, picture Italy in that terrible winter of 218-217 BCE. In the north, Carthaginian campfires dotted the landscape while Hannibal's soldiers rested in comfortable quarters, their bellies full and their confidence high after their stunning victories. In the south, Roman messengers rode through the night, carrying desperate dispatches, while in every city and town throughout the peninsula, citizens wondered whether they would live to see another spring under Roman rule. The boy who had sworn his oath of eternal enmity at his father's altar had grown into a man capable of bringing Rome to its knees, but the Romans, for all their defeats and disasters, had not yet played their strongest card. The true test of their civilization lay not in their ability to win battles, but in their capacity to endure defeat without losing hope, to rebuild their strength after catastrophic losses, and to outlast enemies who might be more brilliant but were less persistent than themselves. The greatest chapter in the long rivalry between Rome and Carthage was about to unfold, and the world would discover whether Roman institutions could survive the genius of Hannibal Barca. The spring of 217 BCE brought no relief to Roman anxieties, only the chilling realization that Hannibal's winter quarters had been preparation for an even bolder campaign. As the snows melted in the Alpine passes, closing off his route of retreat, the Carthaginian commander faced a stark choice: conquer or perish in the attempt. He chose conquest, and with it unleashed upon Italy a campaign of such audacious brilliance that it would be studied by military strategists for millennia to come. Hannibal's route south led through the treacherous marshlands of the Arno River, a landscape that seemed designed by the gods themselves to test mortal endurance. For 4 days and 3 nights, his army slogged through fetid swamps where solid ground was a luxury and sleep came only while standing waist-deep in stagnant water. Men fell sick from the poisonous vapors, animals collapsed from exhaustion, and equipment was abandoned in the sucking mud. Even Hannibal himself paid a terrible price for this crossing, losing sight in one eye to an infection that would mark him for the rest of his days. Yet this suffering served a purpose beyond mere passage. While Hannibal's army endured the horrors of the marsh, the Roman consul Gaius Flaminius was racing north with 25,000 legionaries, confident that he could trap the Carthaginians in the difficult terrain and destroy them before they could reach central Italy. Flaminius was a capable commander, popular with his troops and experienced in warfare. But he possessed the fatal flaw that Hannibal had learned to exploit in Roman generals: an eagerness for glory that could override tactical caution. When the Carthaginian army emerged from the marshlands and began ravaging the fertile plains of Etruria, Flaminius took the bait exactly as Hannibal had predicted. Rather than waiting for reinforcements or choosing favourable ground for battle, the Roman consul pursued his elusive enemy with single-minded determination. His legions marched along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, following a narrow road hemmed in by the lake on one side and steep hills on the other, terrain that any cautious commander would have recognized as perfect for an ambush. Hannibal had spent days preparing his trap with the meticulous care of a master craftsman. His Gallic and Spanish troops were concealed in the hills overlooking the road, invisible to Roman scouts, who saw only empty ridgelines and peaceful morning mist. His African veterans, the elite core of his army, waited in the hills beyond the lake, where they could strike the Roman column's head once it had fully entered the killing ground. Even the weather seemed to conspire with the Carthaginian plan, as a thick fog rolled in from the lake to provide additional concealment. On the morning of June 21st, 217 BCE, Flaminius led his legions into what would become known as one of the most perfect ambushes in military history. The Roman column stretched for miles along the lakeshore, its formations loosened by the difficult terrain and limited visibility. The soldiers chatted among themselves as they marched, confident in their numbers and their commander's assurances that they would soon bring the elusive enemy to battle on favourable terms. The attack came without warning from 3 directions simultaneously. Gallic war cries echoed from the hills as thousands of warriors poured down upon the unsuspecting Romans, while Spanish swordsmen struck from concealed positions along the roadside. The Roman column, strung out and unable to form proper battle lines in the confined space, found itself caught between the advancing enemy and the waters of the lake. Flaminius himself died early in the battle, struck down as he tried desperately to rally his men in the chaos of the surprise attack. With their commander dead and their formation shattered, the legions dissolved into a mass of individual soldiers fighting for their lives, rather than organized units implementing tactical plans. Some Romans threw down their weapons and plunged into the lake, preferring to drown rather than face Carthaginian steel. Others fought with desperate courage in small groups, selling their lives dearly but unable to affect the battle's outcome. The slaughter continued for 3 hours until the morning mist finally cleared to reveal the full extent of the catastrophe. Nearly 15,000 Romans lay dead around the lake's shore, their blood staining the water red for days afterward. Another 10,000 had been captured, including an entire Roman legion that had been cut off and surrounded during the battle's early stages. Hannibal's losses were minimal, perhaps 1,500 men, mostly Gauls who had borne the brunt of the fiercest Roman resistance. The psychological impact of Trasimene exceeded even its military significance. In a single morning, Rome had lost 2 complete armies and 2 consuls within 6 months. The road to Rome itself lay open, defended only by hastily assembled militia and the prayers of a population that had begun to wonder whether the gods themselves had abandoned their chosen city. Throughout Italy, Rome's allies watched and waited, calculating whether their loyalty to the Republic was worth maintaining in the face of such overwhelming Carthaginian success. Yet Hannibal's response to this tremendous victory revealed both his strategic brilliance and the fundamental limitation of his position. Rather than marching directly on Rome while the city reeled from the news of Trasimene, he turned his army eastward toward the Adriatic coast. This decision puzzled his officers and disappointed his Gallic allies, who had expected to share in the plunder of the world's greatest city. But Hannibal understood what they did not, that Rome's true strength lay not in its walls, but in the loyalty of its allies throughout Italy. The Carthaginian commander began a systematic campaign to detach Rome's Italian confederates, offering generous terms to cities that submitted voluntarily, while demonstrating the futility of resistance to those that remained loyal to Rome. His treatment of prisoners captured at Trasimene embodied this strategy. Roman citizens were kept in chains to be ransomed or exchanged, but Italian allies were released without payment and sent home with messages of Carthaginian friendship and promises of better treatment under new management. This policy of calculated magnanimity began to bear fruit as communities throughout southern Italy reconsidered their allegiances. The psychological warfare was as important as the military campaigns, as Hannibal sought to convince Rome's allies that they were fighting on the losing side of a conflict that had already been decided. Each defection weakened Rome's manpower base while strengthening Carthaginian forces, creating a snowball effect that could eventually make resistance impossible. The Romans, meanwhile, faced their greatest constitutional crisis since the founding of the Republic. The normal machinery of government seemed inadequate to cope with an enemy who had already destroyed 2 consular armies and threatened the very existence of the state. In this desperate hour, the Senate took an unprecedented step. They appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, and granted him emergency powers to save the Republic. Fabius was an older man, experienced in both war and politics, whose cautious temperament was perfectly suited to Rome's desperate circumstances. He understood that Hannibal's army, for all its tactical brilliance, suffered from fundamental strategic weaknesses that could be exploited by patient and persistent opponents. The Carthaginians were far from home, dependent on uncertain supply lines, and operating in enemy territory, where every village and farmstead might harbour hostile forces. The strategy that Fabius developed was as psychologically difficult as it was militarily sound. Rather than seeking the glorious battle that Roman tradition demanded, he would shadow Hannibal's army at a safe distance, striking at foraging parties and supply trains while avoiding major engagements. The Carthaginians would be worn down through constant harassment and the gradual attrition of their strength, denied the decisive victory they needed to end the war quickly. This approach earned Fabius the nickname Cunctator, the Delayer, a title that was initially meant as an insult, but would eventually become a badge of honour. His fellow Romans, accustomed to aggressive warfare and swift resolution of conflicts, found his cautious methods frustrating and even cowardly. Young officers chafed at missed opportunities to strike glorious blows against the enemy, while politicians worried that such passive resistance would encourage more allies to defect to the Carthaginian cause. The tension between Fabius and his critics came to a head when the dictator's second-in-command, Marcus Minucius Rufus, ambushed a Carthaginian foraging party and won a minor but well-publicized victory. The The Roman people, desperate for any good news after months of disasters, hailed Minucius as a hero and demanded that he be given equal authority with Fabius. This unprecedented division of command nearly led to catastrophe when Minucius led his forces into a Carthaginian trap and was saved only by Fabius's timely intervention. The incident demonstrated both the wisdom of Fabius's strategy and the political difficulties it created. His methods were working. Hannibal's army was growing weaker with each passing month. His Gallic allies were deserting in increasing numbers, and his ability to maintain the initiative was gradually eroding. But the Roman people could see only their farms burning and their enemies marching unopposed through their territory, while their own armies seemed afraid to fight. As Fabius's term as dictator ended and normal consular government resumed, the debate over strategy intensified. The new consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, represented opposing approaches to the Carthaginian threat. Varro, a man of the people who had risen through political skill rather than noble birth, advocated aggressive action and decisive battle. Paulus, from an ancient patrician family with extensive military experience, favoured continuing Fabius's cautious approach. The Roman people and Senate, frustrated by months of apparent inaction, sided with Varro's aggressive stance. They authorized the largest army in Roman history, 8 legions totaling nearly 90,000 men, and sent it south to bring Hannibal to battle on Roman terms. This massive force represented an enormous commitment of Roman resources and manpower, drawn from throughout Italy and including the flower of Roman youth. If this army could defeat Hannibal decisively, the Carthaginian threat would be ended forever. Hannibal, recognizing that time was working against him, welcomed the prospect of a major battle. His army had been reinforced by Italian allies and Gallic recruits, bringing his total strength to about 50,000 men, but he knew that Roman resources were far greater than his own. If he could not win a decisive victory soon, the gradual attrition of his forces would eventually make his position untenable. The approaching Roman army offered both the greatest danger and the greatest opportunity of his career. The two armies converged near the small town of Cannae in southeastern Italy, where Hannibal had established a fortified camp controlling the local grain supplies. The position was well chosen, offering good ground for the cavalry operations that were Hannibal's greatest strength, while denying the Romans the ability to use their superior numbers effectively. As the opposing forces faced each other across the Aufidus River, both commanders knew that the coming battle would likely determine the fate of the war. The Roman plan was straightforward, relying on their traditional strengths of superior numbers and disciplined infantry. They would form an exceptionally deep phalanx in the centre, using sheer weight of numbers to smash through the Carthaginian line and then roll up the enemy flanks. With nearly 2-to-1 numerical superiority, this direct approach seems certain to succeed, where more complex manoeuvres might fail. Hannibal's response demonstrated the tactical genius that had made him legendary throughout the ancient world. Rather than trying to match Roman numbers with his own inferior forces, he would use their strength against them. His plan required perfect timing and absolute trust between different ethnic contingents of his army, but if successful, it would turn the Roman advantage into a fatal weakness. On August 2nd, 216 BCE, the two armies deployed for what would become the most studied battle in military history. The Romans formed their traditional checkerboard formation, but with unusually deep ranks, creating a massive battering ram of heavy infantry aimed at the Carthaginian centre. Hannibal placed his weakest troops, recently recruited Gauls and Spaniards, in the centre of his line, with his veteran African infantry hidden on the flanks and his superior cavalry protecting the wings. As the battle began, events unfolded exactly as Hannibal had planned. The Roman center, led by Varro himself, crashed into the Carthaginian line with tremendous force, driving the Gauls and Spaniards steadily backward. To the Roman commanders, it appeared that their strategy was working perfectly. The enemy center was crumbling under the weight of their assault, and victory seemed within reach. But Hannibal's retreat was carefully controlled, his center bending but not breaking as it drew the Roman legions deeper into the trap. As the Romans pressed forward, their formation became increasingly compressed and disorganized, with the rear ranks pushing the front ranks forward, even when the men in front could see the danger developing around them. The Romans found themselves in an ever-narrowing corridor, their flanks exposed to the African veterans who had remained hidden until this crucial moment. When Hannibal finally sprang his trap, the result was devastating beyond anything seen in ancient warfare. The African infantry struck the Roman flank simultaneously while the Carthaginian cavalry, having routed their Roman counterparts, attacked from behind. In a matter of minutes, the Roman army found itself completely surrounded, compressed into an ever-shrinking space where their numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. The slaughter that followed was systematic and complete. Packed so tightly that they could barely raise their weapons, the Romans were cut down by the thousands as Carthaginian forces contracted their ring of steel. Consul Paulus died fighting in the ranks, preferring death to the shame of such a defeat. Many Roman officers, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, killed themselves rather than face capture. Others threw away their weapons and tried to flee, only to be hunted down by Carthaginian cavalry on the open plain. By the battle's end, the Roman army had ceased to exist. Nearly 70,000 men lay dead on the field of Cannae, including 80 senators, 29 military tribunes, and countless other members of Rome's ruling class. It was the worst military disaster in Roman history, exceeding even the Gallic sack in its scope and implications. Hannibal's losses were minimal, perhaps 6,000 men, mostly from the Gallic and Spanish troops, who had borne the brunt of the initial Roman assault. The news of Cannae struck Rome like a thunderbolt. For days, the city was paralyzed by grief and terror as the full extent of the catastrophe became clear. Mothers searched the lists of the dead for their sons' names, wives mourned husbands who would never return, and the Senate struggled to comprehend how their greatest army had been so completely annihilated. Some spoke of abandoning the city and fleeing to the provinces, while others prepared for a siege that seemed certain to come. Yet even in this darkest hour, the Roman character revealed itself in ways that would define the Republic's ultimate triumph. Rather than suing for peace or abandoning the struggle, the Romans grimly prepared to continue the war with whatever resources remained to them. New armies were raised from slaves and criminals. Desperate alliances were forged with former enemies, and the entire population was organized for total war in a way that had never been attempted before. The Senate's response to the disaster embodied the stubborn determination that was Rome's greatest strength. They decreed that no one should mourn publicly for the dead, that no ransoms would be paid for Roman prisoners, and that the war would continue until Carthage was defeated or Rome destroyed. This iron resolve, in the face of catastrophic defeat, demonstrated to friend and enemy alike that Rome would never surrender, no matter how desperate its circumstances became. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, imagine the Mediterranean world holding its breath in the aftermath of Cannae. From Gaul to Egypt, kings and generals wondered whether they were witnessing the end of Roman power and the birth of a Carthaginian empire. In Italy itself, cities that had remained loyal to Rome for centuries began to waver, while others openly declared for Hannibal in the belief that they were choosing the winning side. But Hannibal, for all his tactical brilliance, had achieved only a military victory. The true test of his conquest would be whether he could transform battlefield success into lasting political control. Rome's greatest strength, the loyalty of its Italian allies, and the resilience of its institutions had been shaken but not broken. The war that many thought was ending at Cannae was in reality entering its most crucial phase, as Rome prepared to demonstrate that defeat in battle did not mean defeat in war. The aftermath of Cannae revealed the true genius of Roman civilization, not in victory but in defeat. While lesser peoples might have collapsed under such catastrophic losses, the Romans displayed a resilience that would echo through the centuries. They understood that wars were won not by individual battles, no matter how brilliant, but by the sustained will of an entire people committed to ultimate victory. Hannibal's triumph had been complete on the tactical level, but strategically, he faced challenges that his military genius could not overcome. His army, though victorious, remained isolated in hostile territory, with no secure base of operations. Each casualty was irreplaceable, while Rome could draw upon the vast manpower reserves of its Italian confederation. The Carthaginian general needed to convert his battlefield success into lasting political gains, and time was working against him. The defection of several Italian cities following Cannae seemed to validate Hannibal's strategy of detaching Rome's allies. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to the Carthaginians with elaborate ceremonies and promises of mutual support. Other communities in southern Italy followed suit, calculating that Roman power was broken and that accommodation with the victor was both prudent and inevitable. Yet these defections, while significant, fell short of the wholesale collapse that Hannibal needed. The crucial regions of central Italy remained loyal, as did most of the Latin cities, whose citizens enjoyed a stake in Roman success. The Italian Confederation, tested by its greatest crisis, bent but did not break. Those allies who remained faithful would be rewarded for their loyalty, while those who defected would face terrible retribution when Roman fortunes revived. In Rome itself, the response to disaster was characteristically practical. Rather than wasting time on recriminations or despair, the Romans set about rebuilding their military strength with methodical determination. Slaves were freed and armed, debtors were released from prison to serve in the legions, and boys barely old enough to carry weapons were enrolled in new units. The city that had seemed defenseless after Cannae began to bristle with the preparations of a people who refused to accept defeat. The strategy that emerged from these dark days combined the caution of Fabius with innovations born of necessity. Multiple smaller armies would shadow Hannibal's movements while avoiding the kind of decisive battle that had led to disaster. Roman forces would focus on retaking cities that had defected, cutting Carthaginian supply lines, and gradually wearing down the invaders through constant pressure. It was unglamorous warfare, requiring patience and persistence rather than heroic gestures, but it suited Roman temperament and resources. Meanwhile, the war expanded beyond Italy, as Rome sought to strike at Carthaginian interests wherever they could be found. The Scipio brothers led campaigns in Spain, aiming to prevent reinforcements from reaching Hannibal while building Roman influence in territories that Carthage considered its own. Naval operations interdicted Carthaginian shipping, while diplomatic missions sought to forge alliances with enemies of Carthage throughout the Mediterranean world. For several years, this strategy of gradual strangulation began to show results. Hannibal found himself increasingly confined to southern Italy, his freedom of movement restricted by Roman armies that avoided direct confrontation while making his position ever more precarious. The Italian cities that had welcomed him as a liberator began to reconsider their allegiances as Roman pressure mounted, and Carthaginian promises of protection proved hollow. The siege of Syracuse marked a turning point in Roman fortunes. This great Greek city, largest and most prosperous in Sicily, had allied itself with Carthage after Cannae in the belief that Rome was finished. The Roman response was swift and merciless. For 2 years, Roman forces under Marcus Claudius Marcellus invested the city with a determination that recalled their ancestors' conquest of Veii centuries earlier. The siege became famous for the ingenious defensive devices created by Archimedes, the great mathematician and inventor who had thrown his genius behind Syracuse's defense. Massive catapults hurled stones at Roman ships, while mechanical claws lifted attacking vessels from the water and dashed them against the rocks. Mirrors focused sunlight to set enemy sails ablaze, and every approach to the city walls was swept by precisely calculated fields of fire. Yet for all Archimedes' brilliance, Roman persistence eventually prevailed. When Syracuse finally fell in 212 BCE, the sack that followed demonstrated that Rome's capacity for vengeance had not been diminished by recent defeats. The city was thoroughly plundered, its population enslaved, and its treasures carried off to Rome. Most tragically, Archimedes himself was killed by a Roman soldier who failed to recognize the great scholar he was murdering. The fall of Syracuse sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world and marked the beginning of a general shift in Mediterranean opinion. Rome, which had seemed finished after Cannae, was clearly recovering its strength and demonstrating its traditional ruthlessness toward those who had betrayed its friendship. Cities that had defected began to reconsider their positions, while those that had remained loyal took heart from this evidence of Roman resurgence. In Spain, the war took on its own character as Roman and Carthaginian forces struggled for control of the silver mines and recruiting grounds that were essential to Hannibal's continued resistance. The Scipio brothers achieved remarkable initial success, winning over Spanish tribes and establishing Roman influence in regions that had been Carthaginian for generations. But their victories proved temporary when both brothers were killed in 211 BCE. Their armies scattered by a Carthaginian counter-offensive that seemed to restore the balance of power. The Roman response to this disaster in Spain would prove crucial to the war's ultimate outcome. Rather than abandoning the Spanish theatre or sending another conventional commander, the Romans made an extraordinary decision. They granted proconsular authority to Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of one of the fallen generals, despite the fact that he was only 24 years old and had never held senior office. This young man would prove to be Rome's answer to Hannibal, a general whose tactical brilliance matched that of his Carthaginian opponent. Scipio's first campaign in Spain announced the arrival of a new kind of Roman commander. Rather than simply following established precedents, he studied his enemy's methods and adapted them to Roman use. He trained his troops in new formations, developed innovative tactics for siege warfare, and most importantly, learned to use speed and surprise in ways that previous Roman generals had never attempted. The capture of New Carthage in 209 BCE demonstrated Scipio's revolutionary approach to warfare. Rather than conducting a lengthy siege of this heavily fortified city, he launched a surprise assault coordinated with a crossing of the harbour lagoon at low tide. A maneuver that his intelligence network had revealed was possible, but that the defenders considered impossible. The city fell in a single day, its treasures and hostages providing Scipio with the resources and political leverage to transform the Spanish War. More importantly, Scipio's treatment of his Spanish captives revealed a new sophistication in Roman diplomacy. Rather than selling them into slavery according to established custom, he released the hostages without ransom and sent them home with gifts and promises of Roman friendship. This calculated generosity had exactly the effect he intended, as Spanish tribes began to abandon Carthaginian service and join the Roman cause. The psychological impact of these victories reached beyond Spain to affect the war in Italy itself. Hannibal, who had remained undefeated in direct combat for over a decade, suddenly found himself facing the prospect of being cut off from all external support. His brother Hasdrubal had marched from Spain with reinforcements, but Roman forces intercepted and destroyed this relief army at the Metaurus River in 207 BCE. When Hasdrubal's severed head was thrown into Hannibal's camp, the great Carthaginian commander knew that his hopes of victory had died with his brother. The final phase of the war in Italy became a slow strangulation, as Roman forces gradually recaptured the cities that had defected after Cannae. Capua, the most important of Hannibal's allies, fell after a lengthy siege that demonstrated Roman determination to punish those who had betrayed their trust. The city's leading citizens were executed, its population enslaved, and its territory redistributed to Roman colonists. The message was clear. Defection from Rome carried consequences that would last for generations. Hannibal himself remained undefeated in the field, but his army was gradually wasting away through constant skirmishing and the impossibility of replacement. The Gallic warriors, who had flocked to his standards after Cannae had long since returned to their homes, while his African veterans grew old in service, far from their homeland. The great commander, who had once threatened Rome itself, was reduced to holding a few coastal cities in southern Italy, dependent on uncertain sea communications with Carthage. The end came not through defeat in Italy, but through Roman audacity in carrying the war to Africa itself. Scipio, having completed the conquest of Spain, proposed an invasion of Carthaginian territory that would force Hannibal to abandon Italy to defend his homeland. The Senate, still cautious after the disasters of earlier years, initially refused permission for such a risky venture. But Scipio's political skills proved equal to his military talents, and he eventually gained authorization for the African expedition. The army that landed near Carthage in 204 BCE was unlike any Roman force that had previously fought in Africa. Trained by Scipio in the flexible tactics he had developed in Spain, supported by Numidian cavalry, whose desert-born skills matched those of Hannibal's horsemen, and led by officers who had learned their trade in the hard school of Spanish warfare, this was a force capable of meeting Carthaginian armies on equal terms. Scipio's African campaigns demonstrated that Roman military thinking had evolved far beyond the rigid tactics that had led to disaster at Cannae. His victory at the Great Plains scattered Carthaginian forces and brought siege engines to the very gates of Carthage itself. Faced with the prospect of their capital's destruction, the Carthaginians sued for peace and recalled Hannibal from Italy to defend his homeland. The final confrontation between Rome's greatest general and Carthage's finest commander took place at Zama in 202 BCE. The battle that followed was a masterpiece of tactical evolution, as Scipio used Hannibal's own methods against him. Roman infantry, trained to fight in flexible formations rather than rigid lines, neutralized the Carthaginian elephants that had terrorized earlier Roman armies. Roman cavalry, reinforced by Numidian allies, achieved the superiority that had always been Hannibal's greatest advantage. Most importantly, Roman discipline and training proved superior to Carthaginian experience when both armies were evenly matched in tactical sophistication. The defeat at Zama ended Hannibal's military career and Carthage's hopes of challenging Roman supremacy. The peace treaty that followed reduced Carthage to a client state, stripped of its navy, forbidden to make war without Roman permission, and burdened with indemnities that would take 50 years to pay. Rome had not merely won the Second Punic War, it had established itself as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, with no rival capable of challenging its supremacy. The transformation of Roman society during these years of crisis was as significant as the military victories that ended them. The citizen farmers who had formed the backbone of early Roman armies had been replaced by professional soldiers whose loyalty was to their commanders rather than to abstract concepts of civic duty. The wealth flowing in from conquered territories created new opportunities for enrichment among the elite, while increasing the gap between rich and poor among ordinary citizens. Most importantly, the experience of near defeat had taught the Romans that their survival depended on maintaining military superiority over all potential rivals. The defensive mentality that had characterized the early Republic gave way to an aggressive expansionism that saw threats everywhere and responded to each with overwhelming force. Rome had learned that in a world of competing powers, true security could come only through the elimination of all possible enemies. As you sink into the deepest realms of sleep, picture the Mediterranean world as it appeared to observers in 201 BCE. Rome, which had seemed on the verge of destruction just 15 years earlier, now stood as the unquestioned master of the Western Sea. Its armies had proved their ability to defeat any enemy. Its institutions had demonstrated their resilience under the greatest possible stress, and its people had shown a determination that made them unconquerable in any conflict where victory was possible. Yet this triumph carried within it the seeds of future challenges that would test Roman civilization in new ways. The citizen soldiers who had fought for their farms and families were being replaced by professionals who fought for pay and plunder. The simple virtues that had sustained the early Republic were giving way to the sophistication and corruption that came with vast wealth and unlimited power. The stage was set for the next great chapter in Roman history, the conquest of the East and the internal conflicts that would eventually transform the Republic into an empire. But for now, Rome had survived its greatest test and emerged stronger than ever. The she-wolf's children had proved themselves worthy of their legendary origin, and the world would never be the same. The foundations of an empire that would endure for over 1,000 years had been laid in blood and sacrifice, tested by the genius of Hannibal, and proved unbreakable by the determination of a free people who refused to accept defeat. The greatest story in human history was still unfolding, and the best was yet to come. Sleep now, and dream of eagles soaring over distant lands, of legions marching down roads that would span 3 continents, and of a civilization that began with a she-wolf's kindness and grew to light the ancient world. The eternal city had found its destiny, and that destiny was nothing less than the mastery of the earth itself.